Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I'm 56 years old. Life hasn't unfolded quite the way I expected. My husband, Jonathan, passed away 2 years ago. He was a good man, kind, but always lost in his work or his thoughts. When he was gone, I thought I would spend my remaining years quietly, gardening, attending family events, and reading books in the evening. But then, that summer, Nathan came to visit. Nathan is Jonathan's nephew, 28 years old, full of energy, and restless in a way I couldn't quite place. He had just finished a long stint in the city and wanted to get away, to find some peace in the countryside. At first, he kept to himself, walking in the woods or reading on the porch. But slowly, he started to talk to me. About everything and nothing. His questions had a way of making me feel truly seen, something I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, I was struggling with the old creaky fence in the garden when Nathan came over and offered to help. He worked silently, with purpose, and I couldn't help but notice the difference between him and Jonathan. Jonathan had always been preoccupied, but Nathan seemed present, grounded. I looked forward to our talks in a way I hadn't in a long time. There was something about his company that made the air feel lighter, filled with possibility. One day, as the sun filtered through the trees, I decided to finally tackle the attic. It had been years since I'd bothered with it, too many memories, too much dust. I tied my hair back, grabbed a few old boxes, and began sorting through them. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his shirt damp from the summer heat. "Need a hand?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Before I could answer, he stepped inside and lifted a heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Careful," I said. "That's probably older than both of us combined." He chuckled and set it down gently. "Good thing I'm here to help." Then, as we worked, we found a box of old photographs. I couldn't help but smile as I showed him pictures of me from my younger days. He studied each one carefully, his green eyes thoughtful. "You were beautiful," he said, holding up a photo of me in my 20s. I laughed and brushed it off. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't matter," he replied, his gaze lingering on the photo before meeting mine. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken but unmistakable. The air in the room felt different, heavier, like the space between us had shifted. I looked away, focusing on the box in front of me. "These old things," I said, "they're just reminders of a life that feels so far away now." Nathan moved closer, his voice low. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel so far away." I froze, unsure of what to say. His words hung in the air, filled with a weight I wasn't sure how to carry. "Eleanor," he said gently, his hand brushing mine as he reached for another photo. "You don't have to do this alone. Life doesn't end just because someone you loved is gone." I looked up at him, my heart racing. There was so much I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, letting his words sink in. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Nathan had gone out for a walk, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My mind kept drifting back to the attic, to the way Nathan's words had stirred something in me. When he returned, his cheeks flushed from the evening air, he sat down across from me, his gaze thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. "Just thinking," I said. "About what you said earlier, about not doing this alone." Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said softly. I see how much you've been carrying. I know what that feels like." His words caught me off guard. "You do?" I asked, surprised. He nodded, his expression serious. "Losing people, it changes you. Makes you feel like you have to hold everything together on your own. But you don't, Eleanor. You don't have to." Something in his voice, earnest and almost pleading, made me believe him. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, even if just a little. We sat there for a long time, the quiet between us comfortable, almost soothing. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly. Good night, Nathan, I replied, watching him disappear into the house. The next day, I found myself looking for reasons to spend time with him, whether it was fixing something around the house or working in the garden. There was something about his presence that drew me in, something I couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, as we planted flowers along the fence, I asked him about his life in the city. He spoke of long hours at work, of feeling out of place, of wanting something more. Is that why you came here? I asked. He nodded, brushing soil off his hands. I guess I was hoping to find some clarity, or at least a little peace, I smiled, understanding. You've come to the right place for that. He looked up at me then, his green eyes searching mine. Have I? He asked, his voice low, the question heavy with meaning. I wasn't ready to face it. Instead, I turned back to the flowers, my hands trembling slightly. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album I had left out earlier. His fingers moved gently over the pages, pausing here and there to study a picture. Is this your wedding day? He asked, holding up a photo of Alfred and me standing in front of the church. I nodded, setting the pot on the stove. It was a lifetime ago. You look happy, he said, though there was a hint of something else in his tone, curiosity, maybe, or sadness. We were, I said, keeping my focus on the vegetables I was chopping. In our own way. He closed the album and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. And now? I stopped chopping, turning to face him. And now, I'm figuring out what comes next. His eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. As the days passed, our conversations deepened. He told me about his childhood, his dreams, and the things that left him feeling lost. I shared stories of my own, stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years. One night, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the darkness, Nathan turned to me. Do you ever think about starting over? He asked. Starting over? I repeated, unsure of what he meant. Yeah, he said. Leaving the past behind, finding something new, someone new. His words caught me off guard, but I didn't look away. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I've always thought it was too late for that. It's never too late, he said softly, his gaze steady. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. The storm rolled in quickly, and we found ourselves trapped inside. I was in the living room, sorting through old books, when Nathan joined me. Need help? He asked, his voice warm. I smiled. Sure, these can go in the donate pile. As he knelt beside me, our hands brushed against each other. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark through me, a reminder of how alive I still was. Eleanor, he said, his voice low. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His green eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name. Something that made my heart race. Before I could say anything, he reached out and took my hand in his. You're not alone, he said. Not anymore. And just like that, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. The days that followed were a mix of clarity and confusion. Nathan and I had crossed an invisible line, one I wasn't sure either of us fully understood. But there was no denying the comfort and the spark his presence brought into my life. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to fall in golden waves, Nathan and I decided to take a walk through the woods. The silence between us was warm, not heavy, like words weren't necessary. At one point, we stopped by a small clearing. He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor, I've been thinking, he began, his voice hesitant. I raised an eyebrow, urging him to continue. I don't know where this path leads, he said, motioning between the two of us, but I know I don't want to walk it without you. My breath caught in my chest. The vulnerability in his words touched something deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Nathan, I said, my voice trembling. I don't have the answers. I don't even know if I'm ready to find them, he smiled softly. Then let's figure it out together. The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my past alone, convinced it was my burden to bear. But here was Nathan, offering to share it with me, without judgment or expectation. As we stood there in the clearing, the wind rustling through the trees, I realized something. Life doesn't always give us neat resolutions or perfect endings. Sometimes, it simply gives us a chance to start anew. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. Together, we stood there, and I whispered, "Let's see where this goes." That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, we sat on the porch with a blanket draped over our shoulders. The air was crisp, and the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment. The road ahead might be uncertain, but I wasn't walking it alone. Nathan glanced at me, his green eyes full of warmth. "You know," he said, "I think this is the beginning of something good." I nodded, my heart light. "I think so too." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the world and the promise of tomorrow, I let myself believe it. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. And as for the future, well, that was ours to write.